Some of you will accuse me of taking Pike out of context. Remember, he said it was the general understanding. General, according to Merriam-Webster, relating to the main or major parts of something rather than the details, not specific. The general understanding. Okay? He's not saying the general understanding is wrong. He's saying, well, this is generally how they look at it. Now let's get more specific. Thus it is, according to the general understanding, that one fights well the battle of life. And he goes on. Okay, in the next paragraph. Now this is when they get more specific by definition. But that which is the greatest battle and in which the truest honor and most real success are to be won is that which our intellect and reason and moral sense, our spiritual natures, fight against our sensual appetites and evil passions, our earthly and material or animal nature. Therein only are the true glories of heroism to be won. There only the success that entitles us to triumphs. In every human life that battle is fought, and those who win elsewhere often suffer ignominious defeat, and disastrous rout, and discomfiture, and shameful downfall in this encounter. He goes on to say, you have heard more than one definition of Freemasonry. The truest and the most significant you have yet to hear. It is taught to the entered apprentice, the fellow craft, and the master, and it is taught in every degree through which you have advanced to this. It is the definition of what Freemasonry is, of what its purpose is, and its very essence and spirit are. And it has for every one of us the force and sanctity of a divine law, and imposes on every one of us a solemn obligation. Going down to the last paragraph on the page. Freemasonry is the subjugation of the human that is in man by the divine, the conquest of the appetites and passions by the moral sense and the reason, a continual effort, struggle, and warfare of the spiritual against the material and sensual. That victory, when it has been achieved and secured, and the conqueror may rest upon his shield and wear the well-earned laurels, is the true holy empire. Now, the word holy empire is capitalized. So when you really look at what he's saying here, he's saying that there's a divine empire, and every empire obviously has an order to it. So what he's really getting at is, yes, you are supposed to subjugate men, but you're supposed to do it from a Masonic understanding of what spirituality is and what it means for the spiritual nature to conquer the material and the sensual. And that, of course, when you go in, is the Luciferian doctrine. You know, when you go on to for example, you go on to, see, what is this? The next, see, two. I just saw this. Okay, go 2, 3, 4 pages ahead on the bottom of the page. Of that equilibrium between good and evil, and light and darkness in the world, which assures us that all is the work of the infinite wisdom, and of an infinite love, and there is no rebellious demon of evil, or principle of darkness coexistent and in eternal controversy with God, or the principle of light and of good, by attaining to the knowledge of which equilibrium we can, through faith, see that the existence of evil, sin, suffering, and sorrow in the world is consistent with the infinite goodness as well as the infinite wisdom of the Almighty. It goes on to say, of that equilibrium between authority and individual action, which constitutes free government, by settling on immutable foundations, liberty with obedience to law, equality with subjection to authority, and fraternity with subordination to the wisest and the best. So when you listen to all these things that he's saying, okay, going back, let's just go through this real quick and let's just wrap it up. He starts off by saying life is a battle, and to fight the battle heroically and well is the great purpose of every man's existence who is worthy and fit to all.
to live it all. He goes on to say to win wealth, to subjugate men by our intellect, and so on. And this by the shrewdness of the closed dealer, the boldness of the unscrupulous operator, ever by the knaveries of the stock board and the gold room. And, he basically says these also are deemed to be among the great successes of life. And earlier in that paragraph, he said this is according to the general understanding. Then he gets more specific and talks about the battle between the spiritual nature and the sensual appetites and evil passions. When you truly listen to what he's saying, okay, well, let's go on. He goes on to say, he basically goes on to, parts I didn't cover is he talks about the noblest purpose of life, to master, that which is in him, spiritual and divine, over that which is material and sensual. So he's basically setting it up so that everybody listens to their superiors, quote unquote. And that's a pretty good way to describe it when you see that he goes on to say the subjugation to authority and fraternity with subordination to the wisest and the best. So this idea that Freemasons are all equal is nonsense. Pike flat out says in his 32-degree chapter that you will be subordinate. You'll be subordinated by the quote-unquote wisest and the best. And this is laying out the philosophy. Those who apply this philosophy the best and masterfully as Master Masons and beyond are quote-unquote the wisest and the best. And that he's building a holy empire. So he has thoroughly established that there's a general understanding of how to do things. And then there's a higher understanding of how to listen to authority and to ignore your own impulses and sensual and earthly or worldly desires for the greater good and for a greater reward in the long term here on earth and the thereafter. Now, all this sounds fine and well if you're an idiot, right? Also, one thing I forgot to cover is no one can have a right to think meanly of his race unless he also thinks meanly of himself. So he's basically a Confederate general that's spelling out that Masonry, especially the Scottish Rite, is about thinking highly of your race and being subordinate to the wisest and the best. So from a Masonic perspective, this is a mostly white fraternity. They're going to have white people being considered the wisest and the best, and everyone else is going to be subordinate to them. And that, of course, is how it's set up. And considering that whites brought black people into Masonry on record around the time that the Declaration of Independence, within 2 decades or so, I forgot the exact date, it's very obvious what is going on here. Okay? That they're building an empire and it's influencing society, and that is the very purpose of Masonry. And he says liberty with obedience to law. It says that you're free to do whatever you want as long as you obey the law. You are equal, but you're subjected to authority, which is really a contradiction, right? You're not equal with the authority because they tell you what to do. It's like, and they set the rules in a way that is favorable to themselves. And they say, well, the rule applies to me too. And the rule is that people like me can do this, that, and the other thing, and people like you can only do that. And if you become someone like me by masterfully applying the principles of Masonry, then you too can do this, that, and the other thing. I mean, once you really listen to what they're saying, right? And of course, he goes on to say that there is no rebellious demon of evil. That all these things are the work. He says it's all. He says is consistent with the infinite goodness as well as with the infinite wisdom of the Almighty. He says, see that the existence of evil, sin, suffering, and sorrow in the world is consistent with the infinite goodness as well as the infinite wisdom of the Almighty. So according to Masons, if a Master Mason tells you to do something that you think is wrong, you should do it anyway because you are subordinate to the wisest and the best. And you need to put away your desires, and self-righteousness, if you think carefully and you infer the correct points is also considered a sensual desire. It's like your ego gone wild. It says, well, I think this is wrong. And they want you to say, no matter what you think, you should do what they think because they understand God better than you do. So you might think it's wrong, but it is consistent with the infinite wisdom of God and the divine, and your superiors in Masonry know better than you about whether it is right or wrong. You've got to understand what they're saying here. You've got to understand what they're getting at and what they are flat out saying, and you have to piece it together. It's like pieces of the puzzle, or different stones or different bricks in a building. By themselves, they're just bricks. They're meaningless bricks. But once you apply the 32 bricks, or the 32 parts, or the 32 walls, the 32 layers of the building, then you get the Masonic building, the temple of Masonry, the temple which is the instruction, which must be maintained by the Masons from the perspective of the Masons. The order of the temple, the order of the Knights Templars, the order of the Illuminati, the order of the parts that fit together that make the picture clear. So once you get the picture and put all the paint in the right place, you see what they're saying. And what they're saying is basically the most totalitarian sort of system that one could have is an autocracy. It is an oligarchy. It is the rule of an elite who are considered the wisest and the best. And when you look at the general understanding and the greater understanding, these people also accumulate wealth. The wisest and the best in the eyes of the Masons are rich people who have a greater understanding of Masonry and not just their respective fields of science. Because they're the experts when it comes to, electrical engineering, microbiology, astrophysics. But when it comes to Masonry and the order of the world, as explained by the divine, there is an elite group of 33rd degree Masons and above who are giving the instructions. And whether you think it's right or wrong, it's too late. You've taken an oath. Now you can leave Masonry, be one of the few people who leave, but you must keep the secrets. So either you are helping them or you are heavily frowned upon by them for leaving. There is no in between. You are subordinate to the quote-unquote wisest and the best. You are following them about what is right, not following your Christian doctrine. When it comes to being a Mason, you're living life by the Masonic philosophy. And there is no morals, there is no dogma beyond that in Masonry. If Masons during this time period want to do it this way, fine. If Masons from another time period want to do it differently, fine. But what is the dogma is about is that you are subordinated by the quote-unquote wisest and the best, which is really a bunch of rich, privileged people who are working behind the scenes. They're saying, look, things work in society because we work behind the scenes. So when there are higher orders than the Scottish Rite or than your Blue Lodge, you also need to respect that. Don't be a hypocrite now. You're doing it to society. You're manipulating society behind the scenes. So when we manipulate and lie to you behind the scenes the same way you're doing it to society, you need to say yes, sir, with a smile on your fucking face and say you are wise, brother.